We are now ready for our seventh session in the book of 2 Corinthians, and so I encourage you again to keep your Bible open and follow word for word. Now, what we have already seen is in chapter 1 from verse 17 through 6:10 that Paul is saying that his ministry was superior to that which was under Moses. And then in 6:11 through chapter 7, he appeals to them for separation from worldliness and reconciliation unto him. And then we saw in chapters 8 and 9 in our last session that he is encouraging them to complete that offering for the poor saints in Jerusalem and instructs them as to how to give out of love. Now, in chapter 10, through the remainder of the epistle, we find that Paul is establishing his authority as an apostle. There had been those who had come into Corinth and questioned his authority and overstepping their bounds, and they had caused some questions, and plus some of the few of the believers there in Corinth had said, well, he's base in his appearance and presence, but very weak, but in letter he's very strong and bold. So he's responding to all of these things in the remainder of this epistle. Now, for this session, we're going to cover chapter 10 only. And so this will be our seventh session in chapter 10 only. And he's just beginning here in this short section to establish his authority as an apostle. Now, first of all, Paul gives his reply to those who charged him of being weak in his appearance and in his message, but strong in his letters. And that we find in the first 11 verses of chapter 10. But notice the charge that is stated in the first two verses. Paul says, now, I, Paul, myself beseech you, I beg and plead with you, by means of or through the meekness and gentleness of Christ. So I'm pleading with you on the basis of the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base or am lowly. Now, in my presence I'm lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. Now that's what some of them had accused him of being very weak and base when he's with them, but yet real bold toward them in the letter. So he goes on to say, but I beseech you, I plead with you, that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as if we walked or ordered our behavior according to the flesh. So they claimed that he was weak in presence but bold in letters, but that he walked and ordered his life according to the flesh rather than by the Spirit of God. And now we find that Paul gives answer to that in verses 3 through 11. And the first thing he says in verse 3 is that he does walk in the flesh, but not after the flesh. Notice in verse 3, for though we walk, that word walk doesn't mean to propel your body forward by putting one foot in front of the other, but it means how you live your life and order your behavior. For though we order our behavior in the flesh, we're living and walking in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. So our warfare and our work is not after according to the flesh. And so he says he does not use fleshly weapons in his ministry in verse 4. Notice the parenthetical statement. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. That is, they're not fleshly. I don't use fleshly weapons in this spiritual warfare that I'm involved in, but mighty through God to or unto the pulling down or the casting down of strongholds. Now he said, it is mighty in God that I work. Although I'm living in the flesh, I'm not using methods of the flesh, but it's mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. And then he says, he does subject his mind to Christ. Now, what a statement that is in verse 5. Casting down imaginations. That word imagination to be better rendered reasonings. So I'm casting down reasonings and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Now, that is quite something to say, and that we bring every thought in obedience to Christ. In other words, every thought that we have, we put down all wicked imaginations and every evil thought that may run through our minds. We put them aside and we bring them into obedience to Christ according to His Word. Now, if we have it in obedience to Christ and live by the Spirit of God within us, it'll always be according to the teachings of the Word of God that is taught what is right and what is wrong. So he does subject his mind to Christ, he says, and he does it that he is ready to judge the disobedient ones. Verse 6, and having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Now, as you yield yourself there in Corinth to the obedience to Christ, then I am ready to revenge and judge all disobedience. And all disobedience will be judged before God. Now, he also says, in giving his reply, that he doesn't judge after the outward appearance as many others do, as we see in verse 7. Do you look on things after the outward appearance? Are you just looking on me because I'm small in stature and maybe not so strong looking as such? Do you make all of your judgments on the basis of appearance? If any man trusts to himself that he is Christ's, that he belongs to Christ. If any man trusts himself that he belongs to Christ, he's one of his. Let him of or from himself think this again, that as, or even as he is Christ, even so are we Christ. If you think you are, you better think again, so are we. I am also of Christ. Now, if you think you are and you're above, so you better think it over again, that I am of Christ also, and I don't judge after the outward appearance. I belong to Him. And then furthermore, in his reply, he says that he could boast in the gifts that have been given unto him, but not in anything else. I can boast in those gifts, according to verse 8. For though I should boast somewhat more, also of or concerning our authority. So he said, I could boast somewhat of the authority which we have. Now, where'd you get the authority, Paul? Which the Lord hath given us for edification. The Lord gave me an authority and a work and a ministry that I might edify or build up other believers in the faith in their understanding and comprehension. So he says, I have that. I could boast in that and not for your destruction. Now, what God gave me as an ability to serve was for your building up in the faith, your edification, and not your destruction. So what I'm doing is not to harm you, not to destroy you, but for your good and your building up in the faith. And then he says that he will be as bold in presence as he is in his writings, and they need to know that in verses 9 through 11. Now notice again, he restates the charge. For though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed. So I should not be ashamed of that which the Lord has given me, that I may not seem as if I would terrify you by means of or through letters. Now, some think that's what it is. For his letters, say they, are weighty and powerful. Now, some are saying, well, now his letters are very weighty and they're powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. And that word contemptible is a perfect participle, which means having been and continuing to be contemptible. So some people just did not like what he had to say, nor the way he said it. Now, Paul was very logical and straightforward. We find that there was a different personalities of the apostles. Peter was very impulsive and emotional in his presentation. Paul was very logical, down to earth, rational about it, and this is the facts, this is it. Now, that's the reason I think I understand Paul's writings more than others in the New Testament because Paul is very logical, and my mind works that way as well. If it's the fact, it's the fact. You don't have to sugarcoat it nor work around it in any way. So he says, some are charging that I'm weighty and powerful in my letters, but weak and contemptible in my speech. Now notice the warning he gives them concerning that. They may think it, but he says you can find out that it's different. Let such a one think this. Now those who think that I am powerful in letter but weak in presence, let them think this, that such as we are in word by letters, such as we are in the words that we put in the letter, when we are absent. Now when I'm absent, I write a letter, and the same things that I put in those letters, such will we be also indeed when we are present. Now I said, I'm going to be the same way when I'm present with you, and I'm going to manifest the same authority and power and boldness in my presence with you as I do also in the letters. Then we see not only Paul's reply to the charge of weakness, but Paul's justification of his mission to Corinth. And he said, it is of God's measure for me to be there and place of ministry, because remember, Paul was the special apostle to the Gentiles. Peter was the special apostle to the Jews. And then there was those Judaizing teachers that went around everywhere where they were not even commissioned to go. Now, Paul justifies his mission to Corinth in verses 12 through 18. For we dare not make ourselves of the number, or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves. Now, he did not go by his own measure, he's saying here in verse 12, because many people, they commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. And many people are that way. They have their own standard, and whatever my standard is and however I live is okay, but if you don't live the same way I do, you're a bad person. We have a lot of people with that kind of an attitude, and this is the way these people were that were questioning Paul's authority as an apostle, and they were measuring themselves by themselves, and he says, for we dare not make ourselves of the number that do that are comparing themselves with themselves and commending themselves by their own standards. He says, that's not the way that I do it. I don't measure myself that way. But then in verse 13, he says he did go by God's measure of things and what he had meted out. But we, and the word we is emphatic, but we will not boast of or as to things without our measure. Without the limitations which God has given to us, we'll not go beyond the measure of things that God has given to us and the places I'm to go, and as well as the abilities given, but according to the measure of the rule or the line which God hath distributed to us. Now, I'm going to measure things according to the line that God laid out for us to follow and the places to go, a measure to reach even unto you. Now, God gave me that responsibility as a special apostle to the Gentiles to reach even out unto you there in Corinth. And so I have that responsibility, and it's a measure of the line that the Lord has laid down for me in the places I'm to go and where I am to minister. And so I measure myself by what God has given me to do. And then in verse 14, he says, he did not go beyond that measured limit that God laid out for him. For we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure, beyond that line that the Lord laid out for me. I do not go beyond those areas as if I were everything. God made me that special apostle to the Gentiles, and that's where I serve, as though we reach not unto you. That is you there in Corinth. So he says, I don't make my measure less than what God gave it, as if I'd not even come to you. For we are come as far as to you also in the preaching, the proclamation of the gospel of the Christ. we came to you. Now it was Paul who went to Corinth, and the first one ever to go there to proclaim the gospel to that heathen city, and proclaimed Christ unto them. And he was there for about a year and a half, and the church was established under his authority. Then he went on his way, and later had to write these epistles unto them. Now, he did not boast beyond God's measure for him. We see in verses 15 through 17. Not boasting of or in things without our measure. I don't boast of things that's outside of the measure that God gave me. That is, where God would have me to serve, how he would have me to serve, what my ministry was, which is to build up, not to tear down, not to destroy, but to build up through a message of love. Now, not boasting in things without or beyond our measure, that is, of or in other men's labors. I do not go beyond. Remember, Paul stated in several of the epistles that he did not build upon another man's work. Paul did not go to places where someone else had already been and ministered the Word of God and build upon their work. He went to virgin territory. He went to areas where no one had been before. Now, yes, he did go to Rome, but there had been no apostle there before him. It was some of Paul's converts, because in the last chapter of Romans, he names about 26 different people by name whom he knew that had migrated over to Rome, preached the gospel, and got people saved there. And because they'd never had an authority of an apostle, is the reason he wrote the book of Romans, and it is a doctrinal dissertation on the doctrine of salvation. And then he wanted to go there so they would have the authority of an apostle for teaching them. So he did not build upon another apostle's labors and goes into their areas, but having hope, having eager anticipation, expectation, when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you according to our rule abundantly. Now, what he's saying is this: but we have that eager anticipation, expectation, that when your faith is increased, by my coming there and building you up, and your faith is increased because my ministry is that of edification, of building people up, that then we shall be enlarged. We'll be able to go to other places by you according to our limits, and doing it abundantly. Now that word rule there would be better rendered the word limits. So the limits that God has given to me. And after he's in Corinth, then he went to other places following that time. And he is furthermore, to those other regions he's to go to, the limits that God has laid down for him, to what purpose? To preach the gospel in the regions beyond. To preach the gospel in the regions beyond you there in Corinth. To go on to other areas. And not to boast in another man's limit made ready to our hand. Now, notice the two words "of things" are in italics. He says we're not to boast in another man's limit made ready to our hand. Now, others had limits for their ministry where they'd gone. He said, I'm not going to go to those places and build upon them and boast in what is taking place there because of their work ahead of me. Now, as we said before, he was the special apostle to the Gentiles, and so he only went to those and would not build upon another man's work, and that's what he's saying here. So not to boast in another man's limits, but I wanted to go to areas beyond you after you have matured in the things, and go on beyond, and not to boast in another man's limits, which are made ready to our hand. They're already lying there ready for us to take up on it. He says, I will not do that. So he did not boast beyond God's measure and limits that God gave him to go into, to get into another man's work. He'll not boast within another man's field of activity, and boast upon things that they have done. Now, just as some of these false teachers had come into Corinth and boasting of the work there and putting Paul down as not being a real apostle. So he's here defending his apostleship, as he will do on through the next few chapters. Then we find also that he goes on to say, but he that glorieth or boasteth, let him glory or boast in the Lord. If you're going to boast and glory about something, do it in the Lord and not in someone else's work. And he says, if you're going to glory or boast in anything, do it in the Lord, in him only. And then in verse 18, he said, I do not commend myself. Notice, for not he that commendeth himself is approved. It's not the man that commends himself that's approved for what he's doing. And many people make approval of themselves, and they brag about themselves and all that they've done and how much they've accomplished and all the places they've been and all of these things. Many people are that way, even in Paul's day, and we have many that way today. In other words, they toot their own tooter, as we say. They blow their own horn. They exalt themselves. So he says, for he that commendeth himself is not the one that is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. The one that the Lord commends is the one that is approved. So I do not commend myself, but the Lord commends my work, and I do what he has given me to do. So we find here that Paul was charged of being weak in presence, but bold and forward in letter. And so he replies to that and makes it certain that he doesn't walk and order his behavior in the flesh. He doesn't use fleshly weapons of warfare, but the Spirit of God, and that he does subject his mind to Christ. Now, he doesn't judge according to the outward appearance, but he says, I could boast in the gifts the Lord has given me, and I'll not go beyond that. That he will be bold in presence as he is in writing. Now, what he's written to them, he says, I warn you now, when I come, I will be just as bold in presence as I am in my writings. And then he justifies his mission to Corinth because he was there to edify and to build them up and not to destroy and to hurt in any way. And I don't commend myself as some of these other false teachers do, but it is only whom the Lord commends that is approved, and not one that makes approval of himself. We need to learn that we as servants of the Lord are to simply do what he's given us to do and leave the results up to him, and the glorying and the credit and the approval up to him, and not patting ourselves on the back to glorify ourselves.